Here, we turn to Exodus chapter 28, verse 41, and we see that Moses was in charge of consecrating the priests. When he consecrated them, the lineage was passed down generationally, and through those three families at first in the desert period, the Gershonites, the Kohenites, and the Merathites. This is important for us, again, because we do see a clear picture in our narrative that the priests and the Levites were indeed passed down from this family. So next, now that we've kind of identified who they were, at least who we think they are, and who the Scripture says they are, we ask another question, well, what did they do? First and foremost, one of the most important jobs of the priest was to provide over the sacrifices at the main altar. So if the main altar was in the tabernacle, or when the main altar came to a resting place, it was the priest's job to preside over the sacrifice. They would take a sacrifice, they would judge it when a person would bring the sacrifice, they would then offer that sacrifice to God. In offering it, they were essentially slaughtering their animals, they were taking their grain, they were offering it up to God, and that was their primary function. They did that probably more than just about anything else. It was presiding over it. Presiding over it wasn't just being at the altar, but someone had to maintain the altar. Someone had to put fire on the altar. Someone had to clean up afterwards. And quite honestly, it was probably a very messy job. If you've ever been in a meat house or even a chicken farm, you know that working around slaughtered animals is pretty unpleasant. But that is what the priest did, and it was a high calling because while it was unpleasant to us, it was pleasing to God. Another function of the priest was sprinkling of the blood. At certain times, these slaughtered animals, the blood was taken to purify something, whether it be the altar, whether it be the people, whether it be a person or even another priest. Their job was to sprinkle the blood. Once again, kind of a more grotesque picture, but this is what they did, and this was pleasing and acceptable in the sight of God. It was a priest's job, and it seems simple enough to say, but it was the priest's job to pray, to offer prayers for the people, prayers for the nation. It was the priest's job to pronounce blessings. We see this in Deuteronomy 10:8, and most of us are probably familiar with passages of Scripture called the priestly blessings. That was a priest's job to bless the people. It was the priest's job to bless the congregation, to let them know that God has a blessing. It was a priest's job to burn incense and tend to the oil lamps inside. No one else could do that but the priests. You couldn't just go out and hire somebody and say, hey, I need somebody to come in and clean up around here. It was a priest because everything was separated to God. God needed a separate people, or God had a separate people to do and to deal with everything. The priest's job outside of that also involved counseling. We see a picture of in Exodus, and we see it in Numbers in 27 and 21, that they had these two little things called the Urim and the Thummim. Now, we don't know exactly what they were. We don't know if they were rocks, if they were tablets, if they had numbers on them, if they had writing on them. But we know that according to Exodus, that they were to keep them close to their heart, and they were to use them to counsel and to make decisions to judge. And in this sense, the priest was seen as a counselor and as a judge. It was a priest's duty, if you had a conflict, to go to the priest, and the priest would resolve the conflict. Here we see another function of the priesthood, which was that, namely teaching of the law. Because the priest was a teacher and the priest taught the people, the priest was able to apply those teachings and make those decisions. So not only was he a judge, but he was also a teacher. Another function of the priesthood, which to me is rather interesting, especially given the day and the age, was it was the priest who was seen as the healer. And particularly if you had leprosy, which is mentioned a lot, or skin diseases, or usually pretty gruesome, kind of gross stuff, you would go to the priest and he would examine you. Maybe he would examine your arm, maybe he would examine some boil or some icky yuck stuff, and the priest would determine what that disease was, and then the priest would in a sense prescribe a purification ritual or something for you to go through, and then you would go and do what you had to do and offer your sacrifice and bring it back, and the priest would check you out again. And if you were okay, then you were pronounced clean, and if you were not, you were sent away again, or you were just pronounced unclean and you're doomed. Or if you were really sick, you just died and you didn't make it back to the priest. Not only did the priest was he the healer of the body, but he would also, in a sense, keep track of the community and protect it by looking and examining people's houses if the house was unclean. Living in Florida, where it's very humid and can be very hot, I imagine that the leprosy talked about in people's houses was kind of mold. I don't know if it was mold. It was probably some other icky stuff too. But the priest, it was his job to go not only to look at a person and to make a judgment for them, but to look at a property. It's almost like he was a civil engineer. It was his job to judge a house, and if the house was able to be clean, that house would be ritually purified and cleansed, and the people could live there, or if not, the house would have to be torn down. It was the priest's job to determine what was clean and what was unclean. And when we use these, a lot of times we think kind of in the physical, where the priest looked what was clean and unclean because God wanted to take care of his community. And that's certainly true, because unclean stuff could contaminate and affect everyone, and everyone could get sick. The same with the houses. If your houses had a particularly really bad mold problem or whatever issue it was, it could destroy the community. But I think more importantly is that God made a determination of this is what was good and acceptable, and this is what is not. And he chose a people and set them apart and said, it's your job to function in the community, to let them know what is clean and what is not clean. And that job fell on naturally, if you will, on the priest, the same ones who knew the law, who were to teach the law, and who were to know the law. Because if they didn't know the law, how could they possibly judge what was good, what was unclean, and what was clean? The priest had administrative duties. These were more of the boring kind of stuff. Some of it involved heavy lifting. Must be able to lift 50 pounds to be a priest. This involved keeping up the sanctuary, moving it when they were in the wilderness. Certainly they had to move it many times. They had to take everything up, put everything back, pack everything up, keep the bread fresh, bake the incense in with the bread at different times. And these were other duties that it was up to the priest and the priesthood to do. So as you can see, we needed more than just a handful of people. This is certainly why God chose a whole tribe and not just a few people and said, okay, I'm going to have 3 priests. A handful was needed to accomplish all these things. Most importantly, when we put all these together, it was the priest whose job it was to communicate and serve God. While the priest served the community in many sense, ultimately their purpose was to serve God. It was the priesthood, the Levites, that were the guardians of the holy house. It was the priesthood who Israel was able to worship God because of them. It was the good priests, not the bad priests, but the good ones, when Korah rebelled and when they had the incident of the golden calf. Who did Moses say? Give me the good priest. And the priest went and took care of the bad priest. So they had to slay some people to make things right with God. When we look at the priesthood and what it meant to Israel, that they are the ones that helped Israel communicate and serve God, we can realize that the priesthood, as New Testament believers, is important to us. We're not going to go out and offer sacrifices, at least not animal sacrifices. We're not going to go and burn incense at an altar. But what we will do and what we should do is to worship God. And we can look at the priesthood and see an example of those. For Peter declares, we're a holy priesthood. And we can see an example of how that we too, as a holy priesthood, can communicate with and worship God. And more importantly, we, as a priest, can serve God because our service is to Him. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed that. God bless you and have a wonderful day.